Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining our third part in a three-part series of NERC CIP-003-9. Today we have a group of panelists with us today, starting with Ben Sterling with ABS Group, Sean Thompson with NAES, and Joe Baxter with Network Perception. Let's take care of a few housekeeping items first. So if you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to insert them into the questions section, and we'll either take the questions as they come, depending on how many there are, or we'll save some time at the end and go through all the questions, or it might be a mix of the two. Also, a PDF version of the presentation will be available in the handout section of your GoToWebinar panel. And today's webinar is also going to be recorded and will be available on the link shown here. Please allow a couple business days for the webinar recording to be posted, but once that's ready, it'll be posted for your enjoyment. So let's do a quick recap, and I'll talk a little bit about the first part, and we'll hand it over to somebody to talk about the second part. If anybody has anything to jump in on the first part, feel free. So in the first part, we discussed the new requirements and how you comply with them, and what does Section 6 mean for low impact generation sites. Ben, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would make sure everyone familiarizes themselves with is that this is net new requirements for load generation. Now, if you've run a medium program, if you have a high control center, a lot of this is going to feel familiar. But one of the things to keep in mind, especially if you are coming from those high or medium programs, is a lot of the same concepts don't apply to low. So you really have to read and parse Section 6 by itself. You don't have a lot of the supporting language that you do on the medium and high sides.
Exactly. And then our second part was what you should do versus what you must do, and give an understanding of the differences between what's best practices and what you must do to comply, and a little bit about why there's a difference. Joe, did you have anything to add to the second part that you want our audience to know about?
No, I really think that when we are looking at these things as far as just providing, compliance evidence, the performance of that, all of that must be documented and kept separate. I think that a mistake might be trying to cover lows with your medium type of documentation. I think the documentation needs to be something very carefully looked at for the lows. It doesn't have to be a huge amount in detail, but it does, because of the scope of lows, will be a large amount of work. So keeping that documentation distinctive is going to be, I think, important.
Thanks, Joe. And Sean, since you're new with us for this presentation, can you give us a little introduction? And if you have anything to add to the recaps, you can add it here.
Sure. I'm a supervisor in the NERC services group at NAES. I've been doing NERC compliance since 2007 in its inception, operations and planning and CIP. NAES operates a very large fleet with a lot of low impact facilities, and so the standard is going to have a very big impact on us. But, as far as when we're looking at minimum versus best practice, when we look at the standards, it's really easy to go look at the measure and see the bare minimum that you have to do. But the real impact of collecting minimum data versus, robust or best practice data is really going to be seen when we get those requests for information from the regional entities, where they're going to be asking about, our minimum requirements and how we meet that, but they're going to ask about process, they're going to ask about internal controls. And so, I guess my statement, even though I wasn't on the last two webinars, would be, if you're only holding that bar, that minimum bar, you're going to be really challenged when you're responding to requests for information, spot checks, self-certifications, that sort of thing, Keelan.
Thanks, Sean, and welcome to the discussion. All right, we'll move on here to what can make your program successful. And I'll pass this over back to Ben so you can kind of give us an overview.
Yeah, the key things on this slide, and the concept I really wanted to drive home here is that all your compliance and cybersecurity programs start at the facility. You have to have buy-in from facility management. You have to have buy-in all the way down to your INC, INE personnel, to the board operator running the site. If they're not bought in just the way they're bought into the safety culture, you're going to have a pretty hard time. That's why the first bullet under there is it's everyone's job, just like safety. You have to have vigilance. You have to know when things are changing. You have to know when someone messed up and be able to have reports and self-reports, whether that be through compliance and self-logging, or at least getting that information passed up to compliance so they can make the decision. And just like in safety or anything else at a power plant, you have to break down those tribal boundaries and make sure that you have good information sharing across your organization. Um, Compliance has to know the sites. They have to be involved. They have to know the vendors. I like when compliance has been able to visit sites, if not all of them, at least a representative sample, and has regular communication with the sites. And then really letting each site kind of find best practices and then drive to that fleet-wide consistency. But Joe and Sean, any more thoughts on what can make a overall CIP program successful? What are the key points?
Yeah, I have some things to add, Ben. I think the foundation to a robust compliance program is to have policies and procedures in place that that plant personnel, key stakeholders can familiarize themselves with. But it's not just good enough to have those policies and procedures, and we'll talk a little bit about those as we work our way through this webinar. But we have to conduct training on those with key stakeholders, right? And so people don't live in an unaware state. They not only get to hear about NERC, they understand. They hear the key phrases. They understand what a cyber asset is, what a BES cyber asset is. And they become familiar with the policies and the procedures that we use at the facility to update our documents, maintain compliance. And so when we do have a failure or we do have changes to the system, they know who to connect with to get updates to the documentation or to handle things appropriately.
Well, and that's getting that buy-in, right? Because getting that buy-in means that they know that a self-report isn't the end of the world, and that, hey, I screwed up. I plugged this removable media in without following our procedure. I can keep that to myself, and there may or may not be a log of it. But if I'm bought into the program and I know what's going on, I know that, hey, HPI, it's a real thing. I'm going to not make this mistake again. And it's an opportunity for compliance to look at your procedures and go through and say, okay, how can we increase our controls so that we don't have a failure like this again? And again, I just tie this back to safety, because every one of the operational lessons we've learned from safety over the years on how to do continuous improvement applies here to me.
Well, and you said some key words there. Oh, go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
I was just going to say that one of the philosophies that I've, held, it's not very popular in the idea of management training and things like that, but it just seems the practical thing that I've discovered over time is that responsibilities, additional responsibilities especially, but responsibilities cannot be assigned, they must be accepted. So if you don't have people who understand the purpose, you can't just say, all right, you're responsible for this, and they say, I've got all these other things to do. They have to understand, as you say, get bought in. They must accept that responsibility as part of their job, or you're not going to get anywhere.
John, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I would add, I talked a little bit of policies and procedures, but Ben touched on internal controls. And, when I started doing NERC, over a decade ago, and you got into a battle with a compliance violation with the regulator, you were going to get fined. It was going to be a big deal, and self-reports were scary. Now the regulators, they want to see that you have those really robust internal controls, and that when they work, you're self-reporting and identifying that, hey, we did have a compliance problem, but look, we have this detective or preventive internal control that identified it before it became big. And that's why over, in Q1 of 2023, over 80% of CIP violations were self-reported or self-identified. And so if you're not self-reporting, if you don't have controls to find things, or you see that you have a violation and you're sitting on it, that's just not the way to go. Prove that your controls work, show the regulator that what you're doing to catch things works, and you're going to be in a much better position.
By the way, those self-reports are better when it's not, 2 days before the audit begins. Just to point that out.
Yes. And Joe, I was going to ask you, as a former, auditor, to me, self-reporting is a sign of a mature program, especially if it's done in self-logging, self-reporting along the way. And to your point, not, oh, we've got an audit scheduled, now there's a whole bunch of self-reports.
Yeah. When a self-report happens right before an audit, it indicates to the regulator, this is exactly what we talked about in those rooms and in those meetings before the audit. If you see a flurry of self-reports right before the audit team shows up, that's basically an audit prompted self-report that indicates that, we have not looked at our program very closely until we had to start compiling evidence for the audit. And guess what? We found a bunch of stuff that from months ago, years ago, that we didn't know was there. So exactly, you've got to showing, if you have a self-report every so often, obviously nobody wants a self-report, but if a self-report occurs and you handle it expeditiously and you get the extent of condition and all that stuff down, that looks like what's going on in your program.
Exactly. Thanks, guys. I think we want to move on to how these things kind of overlap a little bit, and the differences between the security program and compliance program. So I wanted to hand this over so someone can explain and give our audience a good understanding of why we should see this difference and why we should understand this difference in order to build the effective program.
Well, I can take a stab to begin with, and then somebody else can jump in. But one of the things that I've always said is, while cybersecurity and compliance are not the same thing, they should naturally overlap. And the better the requirements get for cybersecurity, the more they will overlap. Early in the CIP world, we had many highly cyber secure controls, like key fobs and one-time passwords and things like that, RSA tokens, that weren't strictly allowed by version 1 of the CIP standards. So while it was higher in the cybersecurity realm, it actually was not allowed in the compliance realm because of just some of the idiosyncrasies of the way the language was presented. So they are not the same thing, but you can achieve both. You just have to pay attention to where those overlaps are and mitigate those differences. Somebody else was going to say something, I think.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I would say that, a security target can help you be compliant, but you do have to watch out for those language issues, just like virtualization, even today in the CIP world, or trying to put redundant systems in the cloud for control centers, things like that. You get into some of the parsing of the language and some of the things that are fundamentally hard to get around. Now, we can argue whether or not the administration backplane and how those things come into play, but I think the main point here is to hit the two objectives of being secure and compliant. You have to work with both in mind. You have to parse the language appropriately, and then you have to make sure you're selecting the right security controls, because to meet the password requirements of NERC, I could have password 1234 exclamation, and that's a compliant password. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a good one.
Well, Ben, I think another thing here is that when we build out our security program, our cybersecurity program, and we build out our compliance program, that might not be the same two groups that are building those programs out. And so that requires, if you want your security program to be compliant, there's going to have to be a level of communication between your compliance team and your security team, so that security team knows what the important markers are to highlight in the documentation they develop or to build out into the program, right? So, I mean, communication is the key here.
Yeah, how to handle reporting even. I completely agree. Keanu, I think we can go to the next one.
We'll go to the next slide to speak on VERA, which is Vendor Electronic Remote Access. And I'll pass this over to Joe so you can kind of touch base on what this means and how it plays a role in what we're talking about today.
Sure. So there's, as the panelists met to discuss the idea of vendor electronic remote access, which is, admittedly a new term, we just, signified that with VERA. But the idea is that, having documentation on how vendors can access these systems be separate and distinct from basically just the rules and the controls that you use in general helps you, because this is, 6.1. The auditors are going to come and say, give me the evidence for 6.1. They're not going to ask you for all this other evidence. So being able to dig that out, show that it's distinct, show that it's individualized for those vendors so that you can meet the requirements, be able to shut off those vendors, be able to know what access they have, when they have it, and how they get there. That helps us create a tighter system of controls that are granular enough so that you know that vendor 1 can do this and vendor 2 can do that. However, if you're overlapping all of these and just call all vendors and handle them all in the same way, you're not necessarily going to be able to sort an individual noodle out of that pile of spaghetti.
Well, in addition to that, I think the first big bullet point here of documenting all network paths that can be used. I think a lot of times we put blinders on and, oh, this is the way my vendors come in. This is the way my vendors come in. And then all of a sudden, a new skid shows up and it's got a cell phone modem on it. And that can change, and you have to be aware of your environment and validate that what you think is the existing network paths are the only ones. Because I think that can get you into trouble real quick with remote access.
Well, hopefully we've already have electronic access controls identified in CIP-3, right? And so hopefully you already have some tools in your toolbox that you've used looking at that you can pull open. I'm thinking about a network diagram, access control list that you have that you could start with. So I would hope that you're not just starting at zero, that you actually have some tools in place to look at, okay, what is my system doing? What's open? How permissive am I? I know that MPView has a great tool for that. But I think there's things that we can do things that we already have that we can leverage to identify what paths can be used. And that's a big point. It's not just what are you using now? How do you normally do it? It's how can a bad actor get in, right?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is, while we do have electronic access controls in CIP-3 and low impact, firewalls and things like that, I will point out that there really hasn't been audits of that. And, low impact generation has not gotten the love that it probably needs to ensure that those firewall rules are where they need to be in every site and in every organization. So it's definitely something worth encouraging to look at and tighten as part of this implementation of 6 on CIP-3-9. It's a good time to go back and look at all your firewall rules as far as I'm concerned. And that should probably be a continuous process for you.
Absolutely. I would recommend in the low space once a year, to be honest with you, at least. Medium space, we recommend generally quarterly. And of course, in the high space, you should be pretty much every 30 days to have a pretty good handle and a review of those rule sets, what's new, what's changed, what needs to be deleted.
Well, and validating that your business purpose for the exception, right, denied by default, and then creating exceptions, your business purpose is still valid, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Who says that this is there? Why does this rule exist? Who says? Who approved it? Is it still approved?
And all these things that we're currently talking fairly generally about firewalls, very much specifically apply to this. It's just a hyper focus on vendors, but it's really what you should be doing for all your firewall rules as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's touch base on some of the things you would see for vendors. Let's move to the next slide here. There we go. And Joe, I'll let you kick this one off again also.
Great. Well, so with this slide, we're just trying to indicate that, there's, we box ourselves, we paint ourselves into a corner thinking that, I've got a firewall rule. This is what the firewall rule does, and the firewall rule may include vendor access, but, I'm allowing, this site or this application, or maybe this vendor out on the internet to come into my site and communicate with this low impact cyber system or cyber asset. And while I've got a rule there, and that rule may allow some type of access, I'm not necessarily, capturing the information about the vendor. So while my rule set is reviewed and while I'm looking at these rules, I may not be able to distinguish between what causes the system to operate and what allows vendors to have electronic remote access at any given time. So the questions there is, who's connected? What can they do? When can they connect? Where can they go once they connect? How do I know that they're connected? If I want them to get out of there, if I want to disconnect them, what do I do? What can I do about that? Back when I was working at a banking software company years and years ago, one of our engineers wanted to check a firewall setting and got into that bank's firewall, and we immediately got a phone call from the lady who was the administrator at that bank saying, well, what's going on? What are you doing? I didn't give you authorization to get into my firewall. That was an excellent example of a control that we didn't expect, 15 years ago, but they were very vigilant. That's the kind of stuff that should be de rigueur. I mean, that should be just the standard now. And unfortunately, I think oftentimes it's not, particularly down in the low impact areas.
I want to make sure we touch on this question quick before we keep going here, just to make sure there's clarification. The question says, what are the boundaries for remote access? If there is a USB port located within the facility, is that considered remote, or are we talking about off-site remote access?
So it would need to be outside of your electronic and physical security perimeters to be remote access.
Thanks for the clarification.
A USB port on an HMI, or even, let's say you're talking about plugging into a PLC with a TCA, that would be a transient cyber asset that wouldn't be considered remote access. But it would be covered under the transient cyber asset portion of the standard. Anything outside of your physical and electronic security perimeter is the way I would define remote access. But Joe and Sean, I'll let y'all disagree if you want.
No,
well, I would
agree.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Yeah,
I
Sean?
was saying I agree with that.
I would further classify that as, without that asset boundary, because, in the world of the lows, we use oftentimes that electronic security perimeter and a physical, and we know exactly what we're talking about. But, with the low impact, the language doesn't necessarily say that. So one of the terms we coined earlier on was just kind of that asset boundary. Well, wherever you throw that line, wherever you draw that line, and whatever you want to call it, does that access come from inside that line or outside that line? And a USB, what are you talking about? You plug it in a USB, network connector and USB modem. What, it depends on what it is we're connecting to that USB side also.
Well, and also, good clarification, because I would say, for instance, if you had a segmented unit where you had something over 1,500 megawatts and you've split it out, so unit 1 and unit 2 are two separate entities, they should have separate. They should have separate electronic security perimeters, or, would not to use the term, they should have separate network boundaries, very clearly defined from a security standpoint, and one accessing the other should be considered remote access. But that may not be very clear given the current language. So good clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for the question. Hopefully that answered it for you. Let's move on to some of the firewall rules we were discussing earlier. And Joe, I'll kick this back over to you to kind of highlight what we're showing here.
Sure. So inside inside a particular config file, this is just some samples that we had. What we were talking about earlier, and I was saying, being distinctive as far as, being able to know what site, being able to know what rules actually do what. This image on the left-hand side, kind of fails on that, because the line that I highlighted there is, there's a firewall 1 allows any to talk to any on port 8081. Okay, that might support that vendor access. Maybe the vendors from the outside get to come inside using that port. It would hit that rule, but it's not this, it's not granular enough. I can't tell if I need that for everyday operations, or if I need that for vendor access. And if I cut it off, am I not only cutting off the vendors, but I'm also cutting off, my normal operations? That's a problem. The picture on the right-hand side, it goes from an RTU firewall, and it allows a particular port and a particular group of ports. You can see I've dropped down the list of all the different ports that are in there. That helps a little bit, but that also might be a little too macro. The tendency for network administrators is to say, I don't want redundant rules. Redundant rules are a problem. And I've come to the place now where I could say that, I would rather have a redundant rule that has good documentation that I could drop out as evidence in a 6.1 audit request, and be able to say, this is my vendor access, versus, worrying so much about having a tight, non-redundant rule set. But I'll open that up to other people to comment.
Well, I think that that's a good point, and it comes down to, if anyone's familiar with Lean Six Sigma or HPI, it's about that human readability and making sure that it's easy and distinct. So the example you have for the Dell management servers on the right-hand side here, this rule could literally be written as one line with all the different destination network segments grouped in an address object, and that be fine. But because they are different subnets and they are presumably different operational things there, breaking it out into separate rules so that I can turn off one set without the other very easily and clearly, which you could argue, well, I could go in and modify the address object for the destination and so on, and you could, but I'm just, for me, in my experience, having something clear and distinct and easily human readable where less explanation is required, especially in an audit, is of a great benefit to you.
And I would go so far as saying that even further than the audit, just having redundancy and people who can manage this would be beneficial. Sean, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about human performance improvement, there's a lot that we can do with policies and procedures to provide consistency in how people are applying the tools that are available to them, right? And so, when in our policy documentation, we want to be clear about what type of access we allow, how we're going to document the type of access we have, and then that turns into a procedure that our technicians, our plant personnel can go and review and use to apply to our firewall rules. So I don't disagree with anything that's said. I would just say that we can make these really robust by memorializing them in a document, and then training the team on that, so that everybody is consistently producing the same output, right?
Yeah, exactly. Consistency matters greatly in all of this. And it matters at the site level, and it matters across the fleet level quite a bit. If you don't have consistency, you're going to end up with additional RFIs. You're going to end up shooting yourself in the foot.
Actually, that reminds me, we've come across an occasion to create additional documentation on these groups, in NPView and in other tools, obviously, or in the document itself, the config file itself, being able to document what these rules do, but also documenting the object groups. Because just because I have a rule that says this goes to this on that, doesn't mean that I can't expand those object groups and contract them and potentially do so without authorization. It's different, just because I think I have a tight rule, but, somebody expands that object group into a very large, network or something, a whole subnet, that's going to change the scope and the control of that rule. So being able to document on both sides of that, because it's not just the rule, it's also the objects.
Yes, absolutely. And to be clear, where this firewall rule isn't necessarily a NERC rule, but you have a Class C network segment defined on each one.
Exactly.
Anytime you can define it down to the host and or hosts, group of hosts, that's far better. So instead of taking whole swaths of IPs, these are the 5 servers I need to hit. Okay. 5 servers for remote access, list all 5 IPs. The more granular you can make your rule, the better it is.
Right. Yeah, 15 or 20 years ago, we used to try to collapse all of those rules down into one and supernet everything and pat ourselves on the back for, tidying up our firewall rule set. And that doesn't help us sort things out when we look at compliance.
All right, so next we'll get into 6.2 for methods for disabling remote access. And Ben, I'll kick this over to you to kind of start us off.
Well, so I think first you have to start with documenting how you're going to disable the remote access. This should not just be a ripcord. That ripcord break glass approach can exist, but documenting those methods of we're going to disable the firewall rule. We're going to go in and disable the user account. We're going to get your checklist ready for how you're going to do it. And then go through and practice that, make sure that they are functional. In the end, have that break glass approach if need be to physically disconnect, but that should be, we have exhausted all other opportunities in my mind. Sean, I don't know about your feeling on it, but to me, that break glass approach, which I think, especially in the lows, I see labels on, uplink cables on the north sides of plant firewalls, and if we're ever having a problem, all I have to do is pull this. Well, but you lose PI visibility, you lose a lot of things there, and I personally, that approach grates on me.
Well, there's for every moment a power plant's operating, it's making money, right? And anytime we've got to take some drastic step like that could impact, the overall reason that the power plant's operating is not good. And I think it all starts with, well, first we have to have policies and procedures that document what vendors we allow, why we're allowing them in, what they're supposed to be doing. But I really like what you said, Ben. You get your checklist out. Yeah, let's build out a checklist. What do we have to do? Because as we're disabling remote vendor access, we're going to want to be able to gather artifacts of compliance so that when we get our 6.2 RFI, we can show here's our policy that talks about what vendor access we allow. Here's where it talks about when we disable it. Here's a procedure and a checklist for how we physically go and do that. Maybe there's a process after you've disabled remote vendor access where you're running MPView, your config fires through MPView to make sure that your firewall is not permissive. But I want to see all those steps taken, and then I'd love to see if they're generating an artifact of evidence. I want that to be set aside too. But again, if we don't have consistent policies and procedures, if I do that exercise and then you do that exercise and we don't have a checklist and we don't have a policy, the likelihood is that the outcome is not going to be consistent and similar, right? And that's specifically what we need these procedures for, is to have that same outcome, whether Joe's doing the process, Ben's doing the process, Keon's doing the process, right? And so I like that you said checklist. That's big for me.
Yeah, and just to back you up a little bit on that, because I think one of the things that one of the things I always used to tell the engineering teams that I worked with was just think you're back in college and you're in your calculus course, and the auditor's the professor, and if you don't show your work, if you don't show your documentation, it doesn't matter if you got the right answer or not, you're not getting credit for it. And
Mhm. Yeah.
that tends to get the message through.
You could be spending $500,000 on a service to do this for you, and if it's not collecting evidence, you're still likely to get a notice of noncompliance, right?
Yeah,
The
it's a
interesting
very
thing is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the interesting thing is that inconsistency is really apparent from the other side of the table. In an audit, it's like, whoa, what happened here? Why is there this gap? Why is this inconsistency here?
Well, and that's good. And when they see that, there's the next round 2 of the RFI, Joe, is going to be describe your process that you have. What internal controls do you have in place to make sure that this happens like this? And have you done training? Like that's the next level of the RFI that you're going to get. It's not going to be show me your network diagram and your firewall rule set. It's going to be
You
the
bet.
how, right?
Yeah. So,
Well, there's
guys,
two.
before we get too
Go
deep
ahead.
into that, because we've got
Yeah.
some more slides that'll talk about that, I think we should move to the next slide and then we can get
Yep.
into that a little more.
Thanks, Ben. Let's jump into 6.3 and some of the evidence required for that. So, Sean, I'll
So,
kick this over to you. Or go ahead. Who was that about to talk?
No, that's fine. I think with 6.3, this is where we're actually required to have some methods for detecting malicious communications during those remote access sessions. So, I'm going to say it again. The policies and procedures that we have are going to be, those are the foundation. They're the bottom of the pyramid. They need to detail what tools we use to detect malicious communications. We want to be able to identify where we're doing that, where what the devices, our malware or our antivirus programs are on. There's so much thing we can if you have an IDS, an intrusion detection system, or an IPS, intrusion prevention system, that's going to create logs, and that's evidence we can use. There's a bunch of places here where we're going to want to be able to gather documentation from our automated processes. But if you've got malware detection and antivirus detection, but you don't have a process for reviewing the logs, you might as well not have them. And so, Ben, do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah, so for instance, whenever you're looking at 6.3, you have to have one or more methods for deterring, detecting, so on and so forth. So if part of your compliance strategy is host-based antivirus, well, to me, you are not compliant if you do not have documented a method to identify the antivirus, where it's installed, how it's configured, how it's being updated and maintained. You can't take credit for that unless you do all of that. So that's a key point. You can't just say, oh, well, we installed antivirus on the HMIs, we're good. Well, okay, you might have been good for a few days, but now that technology is outdated, it's not being maintained, you're not monitoring it. How can that be a control? Log reviews are great. The more you can automate that, the happier you'll be. Log reviewing and generating evidence based off of that can become a FTE really quickly, especially if you're looking at a fleet of assets. So making sure that you have efficiencies in doing that is a key thing. Your IDS, IPS systems can help with that because you can do a lot of active monitoring or passive monitoring off of the span port, looking at the communications coming in and out. But log reviews are important. You can always use a service like ours to have some of that SOC type mentality, looking through your OT assets. But really what it comes down to is having a documented process of how you're going to approach all of this. When you're looking for malicious code, how do you define malicious code? How do you know something is suspected to be malicious? You have to have a process to define that. Joe, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love everything that you guys are saying. And I think I can still fit this in. The reality is, and I almost said this in the last slide, there are two ditches. There's the idea of, being so specific and individualized that every piece of your evidence and every artifact you create almost looks like it's in its own world. It's an individual, and it's like, well, how does this compare to the rest of the program? That type of inconsistency is very bad. On the other hand, you can get so macro. The other side of the road is that you've got these great big grandiose top level covering ideas or concepts, and it doesn't get down to the individualized site or system. And I can't walk to a system and point to that system and say, all right, tell me about your log review for that system. All right, tell me about how you do malicious code prevention on that system. And that's the level of specificity you need. So you can get so broad or you can get so granular that it can kind of miss the mark, I guess is my point.
Yeah, I completely agree. You have to find that balance, both operationally and from a compliance standpoint.
We've been talking a lot about consistency here too. So let's touch base a little bit on inconsistency and what that looks like. Ben, I'll kick this over to you so you kind of explain the inconsistency side of it, and then we'll get into the consistency side.
Yeah, so really the enemy of both compliance and security is inconsistency. So I like the I like the two sub headlines here. Two analysts, two different outcomes. Two people review a log, they say two different things about it. That's a problem. Or in compliance, you've got significance of contradiction. You find contradictory evidence for the same event or a similar control. This is why process matters. This is why you have to ensure the decisions are being made correctly, and you end up with consequences to how you report things, how you talk about risk, and how you respond to things. In the compliance world, that leads to additional RFIs, will lead to areas of concern at the very least. And don't forget that in CIP, your audit schedule is risk-based. So if your regional entity thinks you're not running a good program and you're a higher risk to the operations of that entity's jurisdiction, you're likely to get an increased audit schedule.
Yeah, thanks. Joe, did you have anything to add there?
Not really. The old saying is that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, while a foolish inconsistency is the hobgoblin of good compliance.
Well, it's no joke with these additional RFIs either. One of the best ways I think to start developing your processes and procedures is to start by reading the reliability standard audit worksheets, and look and see what the auditors are going to be, the questions they're going to be asking. Oftentimes they're not directly tied to the things that directly tied to the requirement. There's some subjectivity to them. And so when we're developing our process documentation, I'll go back to the checklist that we were talking about. If we've got a checklist, it's a lot easier for Tech 1 and Tech 2 to consistently go apply my process, right? And so having consistent policies and procedures can really help you reduce the impact of those additional RFIs that you have. And frankly, oftentimes, if you have the right documentation, the answer to the RFI is just in one of the places in the body of your document, right?
Yeah, completely agree.
All right, let's move on to consistency so we can talk about what consistency actually looks like. And I'll kind of start us off with the security and monitoring side, and Ben, you can jump in at any moment here. But reliable logging analysis, these are things. These two bullet points here are things that a security monitoring company can help you with. Effective threat detection and incident response. As a SOC, we definitely work on incident response. Our capabilities are highlighting that area of expertise. So we like to bring that area and show how we manage threat detections by doing threat hunting and doing those type of activities to help companies understand their threat landscape and bringing those into the incident response plans. And the other aspect of that is also training. So taking the things we learned through your threat hunts and training those out so that people understand how you respond and what the policies and procedures say. Did you have anything to add there, Ben?
No, I actually absolutely agree with you. And what I would say is that this entire chart here is just showing how things build on each other. If you don't have the security and monitoring ability to know what's going on in the environment, then how can you document it? How can you respond to RFIs? You have to have the topmost item to be able to generate the bottommost item. So these are just some points on how things build upon each other.
And then we'll get into the documentation and preparation. I'll open that up to Sean or Joe. Either one of you want to kind of highlight that?
Sure. I think one of the biggest challenge we have in documenting and putting together our documentation is if we are not appropriately engaging other stakeholders. And so, we have a stakeholder who's helping us with security and monitoring, and they're going to have a tool that generates an output. Well, I want to have a conversation with Keon before he runs his tool, or before we go and implement the tool, so that I can be specific about what artifacts of evidence I need that tool to generate. And so, I think while this shows kind of like going from one to the next to the other, to me, I look at it more like a cycle, right? Where we have to engage the people who are developing our compliance documentation have to engage with the people who are putting boots on the ground and doing the work so that we can make that documentation, those procedures functional. If we don't have functional procedures, people with a plan are going to ignore them. They're not going to use them. They're going to be ineffective, and we're not going to have consistency. So, I think a communication in this process is so big so that we're able to get the artifacts that we need out of the tools that we're using. Instead of getting ready for an audit, we get a big data dump, and now we're parsing things and trying to find what's important to us, right?
Yeah, and that goes back to one of the earlier points in the slide deck is, again, you can't just start out with security in mind. You can't just start out with compliance in mind. You have to have both in mind to achieve both.
Yeah, on the subject of consistency. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Consistency.
I was going to say on the subject of consistency and the documentation, the preparation, being able to have a common tool set to be able to do that, to put that, to make a consistent set of outputs of you as you're analyzing, as you're looking. I mean, early on we said, we're looking at, what can happen, what, that type of modeling. Being able to have a consistent tool set across each site and across each system is key to that, because as you're building the documentation with your procedures, how do you make sure that the output of each of those is consistent, and you can compare those over time, because it's you're going to look back in an audit period of 3 to 6 years, depending upon the schedule and where you are in your registrations. How do I look at something from April 2 years ago to April this year and actually get a valid comparison if I don't have the ability to create consistent artifacts? I'm sorry, Keon, go on.
No, that's a good segue into kind of what one of the question I want to ask. But before I ask my question, I just want to make sure the audience knows that please input your questions to the question section of the panel so we can make sure we get to them before the end of the webinar. But my question is, how does culture play a role in this? How does culture play a role in all these areas that we've been talking to, especially consistency? And I'll open that up to the panel so anyone answer.
Well, the big thing. Go ahead, Ben.
No, Sean, you go ahead.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things we focus on, we have a very large fleet, and we want to really have a positive culture of compliance. And so, the biggest thing that I try to do when I go and implement a compliance program at a facility is make it so it's a functional program, and that the people who are employing it understand why they're doing it and how it benefits them and their job, right? And so when I'm looking at the culture of compliance, I want to really talk about how you do your job, how we can make it functional. I don't want to, if something that I'm asking you to do is taking you 10 hours and there's a way for it to take an hour a month, then let's have that conversation about how to do that, make that a more functional piece of our program. And then when I've got to that point, I'm going to train the heck out of it. And so people really, really understand what it is and why we're doing it, but also how they are a stakeholder in that process.
Yeah, and again, I go back to comparing compliance and security with safety. I think you have to go through, and just the way the safety cultures in these areas have built up over time, it takes commitment to building up that culture over time here. I think you can do things. Safety observations are a great way to start adding in items, compliance and operational excellence, things like that. Following Lean Six Sigma and HPI principles, I think, is a great way to move your culture and your process forward. Big believer in that. And I'm a big believer in highlighting when people are participating in the culture and, find something good. When someone finds a issue in a procedure, highlight it, thank them, correct it. Don't just, you can't have a suggestion box that's just a black hole. There has to be some interaction and a feedback loop to the people that you're wanting to participate.
Yeah, that feedback portion is crucial. That's what kind of stimulates more input, more involvement. Joe, did he have anything to add about culture?
Without it, you don't get.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I agree completely, and I think that's sufficient. I mean, if you can't ask people to help you out and have a part and actually accept their responsibilities if you give them no input on it. If you make it 20 times harder than it must be, they know their job better than you do. If you write a procedure that doesn't really adequately cover what they're doing, then they're not going to do it, and they're not going to do it well.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and before we close out, I'd like to give opportunity for everyone to kind of give a little closing remark and give us the bullet points of what you want to make sure we kind of nail home in this series. I'll start with Ben. Go ahead. I'll start with Ben.
Yeah. So throughout this entire series, I think that the key points. So the key points from a compliance side, I would say, is that 3-9 or CIP-3 version 9, section 6, you cannot just take your medium program and paste it onto the lows. It's a little bit unique. It's worth taking some time to understand. I think consistency, it matters. I think your culture from a security and compliance standpoint matters. I think that without setting a good firm direction and making sure you understand the basis of where you're going, so understanding CIP 3 versus similar requirements for medium and high, you're going to run into some issues that could be easily avoided. So it's always do you map out how you're going to get someplace before you leave the house or not?
Thanks, Ben. And we'll hand it over to Sean. Sean, did you have anything you want to bring us home with?
Yeah, I think I really walked away from the first couple of webinars, and of course I participated in this one, with thinking about should versus must versus should, right? And it's a lot of these low impact facilities, I can see them taking the path of least resistance and looking at what the bare minimum is for the measures of these requirements in Section 6. And I think that if you, I think that if you're picking that bare minimum, then you're going to be very, very challenged when you get a request for information or get pulled into a self-certification or an audit to prove that you're meeting the requirement. Ultimately, you may end up not getting a violation, but who knows how many hours and hours and hours you're going to spend addressing requests for information. So I would challenge everybody to look above that bare minimum and look at what you should do and how that's most functional at your facility, and find a better place that's not just the bottom there. I think people are going to be very challenged if they land at that point.
Thanks, Sean. And Joe, I'll end up with you and to let me know kind of what's NP's role or Network Perception's role in meeting NERC CIP for their clients, and your kind of your last points that you want to make sure you get across.
Sure. Well, I'll answer the questions in that order. In Network Perception, the software that we create is NP View, and that is a tool that allows people to analyze multiple vendors of firewalls, switches, and routers, and be able to create consistent documentation, be able to authorize, validate, and verify rule sets, look at risks and things like that. And it's actually the tool that the NERC auditors, the ERO auditors, use in the NERC Align project. So it is a little bit like looking at the answers of the test before you take it. So that is one thing, but overall, as far as the CIP-3 webinars go, and what I think is most amazing is that this is a fairly new area. So we're not entirely sure how all of the audits are going to run. There's been some audits, obviously, but those will learn and get better over time. One of my audit manager, when I was in the CERC region, one of his favorite things to say was, we reserve the right to get smarter. And so audits will become more mature in the low space. They will become better, and I think overall more effective. That just means that everybody on the other side of the table that are being audited are going to have to get their documentation together, have the procedures, and spend some time with this. Again, the impact, or not the impact, but the requirements may be a smaller set of requirements, but overall, because of the number of devices, the scope is quite a bit larger. So while it may take less effort individually, the overall effort will be far greater, I think, in many fleets versus the highs and the mediums. So I just think that's something that everybody needs to really pay attention to. I don't know that we've gotten to the end of that yet and really seen what the effects of the low impacts are in the world of audit.
Thanks, Joe. Well, I know we only have about 1 minute here, so I'll do a little bit of final remarks about the presentation. Remember that the PDF version will be available in the handout section of this webinar, and also the recording will be available within 1 to 2 business days. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. Joe with Network Perceptions, I appreciate your time. Sean, thanks for joining us and bringing in your insight. And Ben, as always, it's always great to talk to you, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining, and reach out to us if you have any questions.